So for those of you joining, I just turned on the closed caption, so anyone who wants to use them can go and hit the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and can read along. If this session is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, either please turn off your video and please go on mute if you're not on mute already when we get started. And then, Chris, how would you prefer to handle questions? Would you prefer people to raise their hand as we go along, or would you prefer to hold them to the end?
We'll say for the database part, I'll ask if there's any questions, then best would be to raise your hand. You can also type your question in the chat if you prefer, and then Ruskin will ask it for you. I probably won't look in the chat because it will be too distracting for me to look back and forth.
Great, great. Well, great. Welcome to, I think this is our second set of engagement workshops at the Under One Sky 2021 conference. If we haven't met yet, I'm Ruskin Hartley. Had the great pleasure of being the Executive Director of the International Dark Sky Association. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us. I just wanted to point out a couple of people we also have on the line. We have Pete Strasser, our Technical Director, and also I'm seeing Tom Reinhardt, a member of our Board of Directors. Thanks for joining us, Tom. So it's my really great honor and pleasure to introduce the true champion in the dark sky movement, Chris Kyba. He's a physicist, but we're not going to hold that against you today, Chris, who has been studying artificial light at night in the outdoor environment for over a decade. He's based in the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam and chairs the steering committee for the Artificial Light at Night conference series. I might also add he is very active in IDA's awards committee, so thank you, Chris, for your participation in that. You have published dozens of academic articles about outdoor light, and you also manage the LoNNe database, the literature database, together with former IDA, my former colleague, John Barentine. And really that's what we're going to be talking about today, the state of science and how you can use this as a great tool. I might also add that Chris is also one of the leading voices behind the incredible citizen community science project, the Globe at Night database that so many people contribute to from around the world. So the format today, we have about 45 minutes. I think Chris has a presentation. As you mentioned, please pop questions in the chat or raise your hand. We're getting to be a larger group, so please use the chat function. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your time.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the introduction, Ruskin. Yeah, so I really appreciate that all of you took the time on your Saturday to come and listen to me. I'm hoping that this will be very interactive, particularly at the end. So as Ruskin said, we've developed a database that I'm going to present to you, and then I want to, as quickly as possible, run through sort of a list of what we know and what we don't know as academic researchers about light pollution. So Ruskin, I can't actually see the video, so can you give me a feedback? You hear me and you see my screen okay?
I do not see your screen, but I see you.
Oh, that's why I couldn't see the video.
Your sound is great.
Super. That explains why I couldn't see
Go into presentation mode.
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was the thing. I couldn't see the little bar on the side, so now I've got it. All right, so we're going to start with the LoNNe literature database. And so Ruskin, if you can run the poll before we start, I'm curious how many of you know what this is, have no idea, or use it all the time. So we have a quick poll just to get a feel for what the audience.
So Chris, my first technical problem is despite having created the poll, it's not showing up. So if maybe people could just put in chat, yes, you've used the database, or no, you have not used the database. We'll get a quick snapshot that way.
Okay, so and while you're typing that, Ruskin, you can take a look and let me know. And I'll say a few words about the database. So it started off in a different system. It's now in this online system called Zotero. The main contributors to it, as Ruskin said, are John Barentine and me. And it covers everything about artificial light at night, including a few topics. Sometimes in specific cases like moonlight is also included. So once in a while, natural light is included. It's nearly all, not entirely, but nearly all peer-reviewed research. It's generally research papers, usually not conference proceedings or books. So not everything is in there. Also, John and I have limited time, and there's now a huge amount of light pollution literature, and so not everything is in there from current time. Definitely, if you look back past 2010, older than 2010, then we're definitely missing lots of things, but there's a lot of stuff in there stretching back to the 19th century.
Well, Chris, the participants have spoken, and I can tell you the
Yeah.
vast majority have not used it and unaware of it. So you have a captive audience today.
Okay, great. So then I'm going to go there. The website is, it's at Zotero, but you can get to it from the IDA's website. It's allendb.darksky.org. Ruskin can post it in the chat. And when you go there, you come to this landing page that I had just shown you. You can view this entirely online, or if you want, you could install the Zotero app on your computer, which makes using it a little bit easier. So let's go into the library here. I click on Group Library, and we come in, and you see a list of papers that will pop up here. There's 3,470 items in the database. So that means if you were to start reading one paper every single day, and you did that going through the whole database, it would take you more than 10 years to get done. And in the meantime, we would have added more papers. So I wouldn't really recommend that. But you can also see that it means that I haven't read, and John has not read, all of these papers. That there's no way that we could handle that. But we do try to skim them, and we tag them with certain keywords. So we have a list of keywords that we use, but some come from the authors themselves. So for example, adolescent behavior drug effects, that's from the authors. So you can search in here for a sensible keyword, like for example, instrumentation. It's one of our standard keywords. Although for some reason that had a star. It's case sensitive. It's just the instrumentation, and also it really works much better on the web application. So let me turn that off. We'll do something different. We'll look for review articles. So these are articles where the authors have scoured the research literature, and they present more results of many other people's work rather than just their own work. And you can see, for example, a review of Skyglow. If we click both of those on, there have been 7 reviews of Skyglow. If I switch it to a review on animals, then you can see there's 34 reviews where people are going into detail and looking across different animals. So if I click these ones off, we can also search within the title, or within the title and the abstract for a certain search term. So if anyone want to volunteer a search term, we could look for it, something that you're interested in. Ruskin, just shout out to me when you get one in the chat. I could do one in the meantime while someone...
we have seabirds, and we have migratory species.
Okay, so I just typed in bridge, so you can see there's 11 articles about artificial light and bridges. We had seabirds, seabird. I'm not sure if that keyword will necessarily work so well, but we see, okay, there's 16 articles about seabirds. Sure, that worked great. And the other one was
road safety.
Yeah, so safety and security are 2 of our, okay, but we can go road safety, why not? Safety. So there's 12 items that are found, but if you also in our keyword look for safety, I don't know why it has a star there. That concerns me. Yeah, something is a little odd there about how that keyword search is working. I'm not sure why. Because I generally use the app and not the. Okay, let me just show you actually that within the app instead, Zotero. So if I do safety, so public safety, there are 4, and with a capital S, there's 52. It's a little silly that the keyword is case sensitive, and what we try to do is go through and remove those. And I think that security is also one of our keywords. So there you can see there's 13 items that are tagged with security. But if we were to take off all of the, if we were to take off that tag and up here, search for safety, I'm sure we would find many articles with in the title. They have 28 articles that have it in the title. So this is a way for you to find relevant research. And one of the problems is going to be, so when you go to it, I'll go back to the web app. When you go to it and you decide you want to click on something like this, you double click on it, it'll take you to the article. The problem is this is an article that's published by Elsevier, and Elsevier articles are generally not free to view. So if I try and find the PDF somewhere here, oh, this one actually, nice. The one I picked happens to be open access. Here's another one, also open access, unusual. Okay, so here we see one now. This is no longer open access. So if I click on view the PDF, it asks me to purchase the PDF, and they want to have $40 just to look at this PDF, which is a little extreme. So what you can do if you need to access this is if you click here on show more, you'll find contact information for the authors. Actually, there's a little mail button here. So you can see this person's email address, and you can write to the author and say, hi, I would like to read your paper, but I don't have access. Could you please send me a copy? And generally speaking, scientists are going to be happy to answer your email and send you a copy of their paper because they like it when their papers get read. So, okay, with that, I'm going to jump now into my presentation. And you see my presentation again, right, Ruskin?
Yes, we are seeing your presentation.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we'll hold questions to the end. You can ask questions about the database and questions about anything I present. So when we think about light pollution knowledge, or we think about knowledge in general, there's this dichotomy that was presented by Donald Rumsfeld that's probably familiar to some people. There are known knowns, the things we know. So for example, if we install lights outdoors, the sky gets brighter. We know that. Then there's also known unknowns. So that's, for example, right now you could go online and you could see what your weather is going to be for the next 5 days, what the humidity will be, the wind speed, but you can't look up online how bright the sky will be for the next 5 days. So that is a known unknown. We know that we don't know that information about how bright the sky will be at your location. There's unknown knowns. These are things like that plants or that urban trees are affected by artificial light. That was already known in the 1930s or so, but there's published papers about it, but it didn't really reach people's academic researchers' knowledge. So a lot of people were unaware of this up until even 5 years ago, and there probably still are a lot of biologists who don't realize that. And then, of course, there's unknown unknowns. These are things that we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know them. So I can't really talk about the unknowns today because I don't know what they are. So my talk is going to focus on the things that we really definitely know about light pollution and the things that we know are open questions. So we'll start with physics. Here's an image I took in the Baltic Sea town of Stralsund, and you could see that a floodlight is missing the church and shining up into the sky and making this line in the sky. So we know already for 130 years or so how light moves through the environment in the atmosphere. And we can use that knowledge together with satellite data to predict how bright the sky is. And we did this, Fabio Falchi led the team to see how bright the sky is worldwide on a clear night in 2015. So that is a piece of information that we know. Problem is that we haven't updated this world atlas. So it's a little bit out of date because we don't know how sky brightness is changing on the global scale. And as Ruskin mentioned, there's the Globe at Night project, it's a citizen science project that everyone in the world can take part in. And you can help us to understand how sky brightness is changing by taking part. We also don't really have models, at least not worldwide, for how bright the sky is on overcast nights. And this is trouble because overcast nights in urban areas are much brighter. And in natural areas, they ought to get darker. And we don't have a lot of information about that. Another point that came out very recently, John Barentine was a co-author on this paper, I believe, is that bits of paint, tiny bits of stuff off of satellites gets up there in space and orbits the Earth at high altitude. And so it takes a long time to come down. And it is proposed that because of sunlight scattering off of this, that the whole Earth sky has become brighter. There's good reason to be concerned about that, but this hasn't been experimentally verified yet. So that's one thing we don't know for sure yet until it's really been demonstrated. Okay, moving on to biology. This is an amazing photo of a soybean field where there's a light up here at the top of this pole, but on the other side of the pole, so you can see the shadow of the pole and the area where the light is no longer so bright. So when a lot of people look at this and they see this brown part, and over here they see this green part, they say, wow, it looks like those soybeans are super healthy under the light. That's great. But when the farmer looks at it, he says, no, I have a huge problem here. What's happening is that the light that's shining on the soybeans is messing up their understanding of where they are in the season. And they think it's time still to produce more foliage, more leaves. That means that they don't go into the flowering phase, and then they don't go into the pod phase where they produce the soybean pods. So all of this area here is lost area for the farmer. It's all totally useless. And it's very clearly caused by the light. And you can see that because of the shadow of the pole onto the field. So that's really cool. So we know that artificial light, even at relatively low levels, on moonlight in some cases, affects plants and animals, and it particularly affects animal behavior. We all know that as humans because we don't like to go out in a dark forest at night without light. What we don't know is for every species, at what threshold various effects happen. So since light from streetlights is so bright compared to sky glow, and we don't really know these thresholds, we really don't have a lot of information about how sky glow is affecting animals worldwide, or plants for that matter. We are starting to have a few examples that are now showing that you can show that sky glow is making a difference for these animals, but they're still pretty few and far between. So that's one of the things we don't really know, is whether this is a widespread thing or if it's just restricted to, a few species of beetle and maybe a few birds. We also don't know what the long-term consequences of artificial light are. So if you imagine that you have a bird that lays fewer eggs when it's in a lit area, but for whatever reason, it turns out that those baby birds are actually very successful, then it doesn't necessarily matter that they laid fewer eggs for the population. So that's one question that's still very open. The other question that evolutionary biologists are excited about is whether artificial light drives evolution. We think it probably ought to, but this hasn't really been demonstrated yet. So we know, for example, that if you take certain moths that are born in the forest or go into their pupa in the forest, and others that do that in the city, and then you raise them in the same place, they'll behave differently. But that's not necessarily an evolutionary consequence, because for evolution, what you really want to see is that the gene frequencies in the populations are changing. So that's still kind of an open question about how light is changing the evolution of animals. Then ecology. I love this image of the Earth rotating around the sun and rotating on its own axis, orbiting around the sun, sorry, not rotating. We know that artificial light changes the relationship between different species. So for example, some bats are able to profit off of insects that are flying around light sources, and other bats are afraid of light and can't. So that changes the balance between those two species. And these changes between relationships between species and animal and plant species can therefore affect things in the daytime as well. We also know that light can be a barrier to the connectivity of a landscape. So if you have a river and you have an illuminated bridge on it, that could be a problem for anything that lives in the river and wants to migrate across that bridge. Things we don't know in ecology. People are very concerned about insect declines right now, and there are a number of things that affect insects. So we know that artificial light affects insects. We've all seen insects fly to lamps. In fact, one of the oldest things in the Allen literature database is about moths flying into the fire. But we don't know in these insect declines how much comes from pesticides, how much comes from destroying wetlands, and how much comes from light or from monoculture. So this is still an open question. And we, as I mentioned already, we really don't know to what extent sky glow impacts ecosystems as a whole. And turning to human health, this is an example of a building that is a residential building where a church, a cathedral is being illuminated, and the lights are missing the cathedral and shining straight into people's living spaces. So we know that if you do night shift work, or generally speaking, if you turn on a bright light in the evening, it's going to change your body. So some of the hormones you produce will be different. When you wake up the next day, maybe a little bit different. Now, we also know that how much light you need to do that is hugely variable from one person to another. So it could be 3 lux is all that's needed to reduce your melatonin by half, and it could be 300 lux. So there's big differences on individual exposure. They're probably related to genetics as well. And it all, for everybody, also relates to what your daytime light exposure was. So were you out in the sun for the entire day? If that's the case, then artificial light in the evening probably really won't matter very much. But if you were in a dim office or a dim classroom all day, then artificial light at night might be very important. So we know those things. We also know that for certain bad outcomes, so for example, breast cancer, there have been a number of studies that have shown that those bad outcomes are more frequent in areas that are more brightly illuminated as seen from the satellite. And we know for other diseases, it's not the case. But even with breast cancer, it's a little bit unclear. In the research I was involved with in Canada, we didn't see this effect. So, so this is still, we know that there's this connection there, but we don't really know why. So going back to this picture that you can see in the background, we really still actually don't know whether light that shines into your bedroom affects your sleep. Now, certainly very many people claim that it affects their sleep. And so I think we should take it seriously. And it's amazing that there hasn't been serious research done into this question. And so since we don't know whether it affects your sleep, we don't really know if it affects your health. We also don't know how the light that shines onto your bedroom window is related to what we see from satellite. So if the satellites are somehow, sorry, if the light shining on windows is somehow causing breast cancer, it's very difficult to know whether, to what extent that's really the case, because we don't even know what's really shining into people's bedrooms. And so in general, we don't know whether this relationship between what we see with the satellite and breast cancer or a few other outcomes, whether these are causal relationships, so that the light is causing it, or whether there is just light is correlated with some other factor like air pollution or noise that is actually causing the problem. And we also don't really know very well what the dose response curves are. So how much light is needed to cause some negative outcome. So I have 2 more topics, and I'm sorry that this is so text-based. Here's an image of Berlin at night. It's very famous because this is decades after reunification, and you can still see more high-pressure sodium in the former East Berlin, and at that time, more fluorescent and gas illumination in the former West Berlin. Of course, the whole city is moving slowly towards white LED these days. So what you can see from that picture is that lighting practice can be very different even for places that are close to each other. So when you go across a country border or a state border, you can see a big difference in lighting practice. So the per capita emissions are also very different. United States, for example, is 3 to 5 times brighter per capita compared to German cities of similar sizes. We also know that your exposure to bright artificial light, for example, in a workplace, is related to socioeconomic status. So if you have a job, for example, as a cleaner, and you're cleaning an office building, you're very often there very late at night and being exposed to light at your work. Whereas a white collar worker who works in that office during the daytime and has a lot more money is sleeping nicely at home during the early evening hours. We also know for outdoor light, that certain areas tend to be much more brightly lit than others. If you look, for example, at the far suburbs, or when you get out into acreages where relatively wealthy people live, those areas don't tend to have a lot of light. Whereas if you look inside city centers, they're very, very bright. And police sometimes, and cities also have the idea that maybe they could control crime by making some places even brighter. So there are connections. We know this clearly, that there are connections between your light exposure and your neighborhood's light exposure and socioeconomic status. They're probably not the same around the world. There are also really wealthy people that live in city centers and have bright areas, right? So it's not entirely clear cut. Okay, what we don't know, we have regulations about light pollution, voluntary ones, things from IDA, things from CIE and IES. We could say, generally speaking, they're not necessarily working so well, but we don't know how well some approaches work compared to others because this hasn't really been examined. We also really still lack information about how ambient light is related to traffic collisions and to crime. A lot of the research, there has been a lot of papers published, but a lot of the research has been not of great quality. So for example, if you took a street in the United States and you did nothing in the 1980s, then the traffic collisions would have come down for other reasons, right? For example, improvements in cars. And lately traffic collisions are going up in the United States, probably due to cell phone use. So there's a lot of other things going on, and exactly how light relates to these two aspects is not particularly well understood, I would say. Okay, last topic is remote sensing and outdoor lighting. So what do we know here? Well, we know if you install light sources or if you change light sources outside, as long as you've done a big enough change, we can see that very clearly from space. So this is great that we're able to see and sometimes understand what's going on. We also know from the satellite data that in most countries worldwide, and that artificial light emissions are increasing. Not all of them, but in most. What we don't know is, so I'm going to skip over to these two. What's responsible for this lighting increase, right? Is it because of brighter streetlights or more streetlights, or is it because of advertising lighting, or is it because people are putting up facade lighting on their houses, or is it a little bit of all of this? We really don't know that. And one of the reasons that we don't know that at all is because we actually don't know what makes up sky glow and the emissions to space at all. So this is an area that I'm very active in with my Nachtlichter app that I could tell you about later, if you're interested, where we're trying to understand how do different types of lighting applications relate to what we see from space or what we see in sky glow. And last point here, which is related to a point on the last slide, is that there's still more work needed on how much light pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers really need in order to be safe in the city. We know that the norms that exist are generally consensus-based. They're not based on research, generally speaking. So there's possibilities for changes there. And we know that there's huge variation worldwide in how people apply lights. So for example, in Germany, very close to me, you can drive on the Ring Autobahn around Berlin. Lots of the regions have no speed limit, including at nighttime, and it's not illuminated. But if you look at a highway, a ring highway, for example, around London, or a ring highway on a city in the United States, those will always be illuminated, even though the speed limit is much lower, right? So, how can this be the case? We don't have an epidemic of crashes around Berlin, so, what's going on? It's not so well understood. So with that, I want to stop. And now the idea is that you can criticize anything you heard me say, tell me I'm wrong, ask me questions. We can look at the database, anything you want to do for the last 15, 20 minutes here. Sorry that the talk took so long. Also, I put those slides on Twitter and got feedback from a number of other scientists, and that ended up making it longer and longer while people said there's other things we know and don't know. Ruskin, you're muted, but are there any questions in the chat? You're still muted, Ruskin. So since I can't hear you, Ruskin, I'm going to go to the first question with the raised hand. Please go ahead, Mate.
Hello, I just want to say that this was really informative. And I'm wondering, how can we research more about the sky glow effects, because the sky glow is it's like it's very diffuse light, and there's not much control you can have. You cannot make a city with a 20,000 lights just to see how sky glow affects the ecosystem or some animal, something like that. So how can we make better or any research including sky glow?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you very much. It is very difficult. You can do field studies. So I'm involved in an experiment that will soon have data coming out actually with regards to aquatic systems. So what we did is we have a mesocosm experiment. There's 24 enormous tanks, 9 meters in diameter and about 20 meters deep out in a lake in Germany. And we put up diffuse illumination over top of them. Now, of course, we can't make perfectly diffuse illumination, or you could maybe, but it would have been much way beyond our budget. So there's limits to how well this really represents sky glow, but that's one way we're trying. Other ideas that people have suggested is looking along a sky glow gradient, or taking advantage of this fact that some nights are cloudy and some nights are clear, and that changes the brightness of the sky quite a bit. So I think, for example, Travis Longcore might be looking into the movement of various large predators in the American West under different weather conditions. And that could help you understand something potentially. But this is where it would be really useful if we had maps of sky glow and overcast nights to help better understand how much light these animals have. So yeah, the answer is it's very hard, and that's partly why people haven't done it.
Can you please link some of those research in chat or something?
I have to think about it, because off the top of my head, I can't remember which papers got into this. And a bit of the things that I know actually are stuff that hasn't actually been published yet, but is that in work. But let's just check real quick. If we go on sky glow and animals in the database, so we find that can't be right. Something I never use this online version here. I'm just going to jump over to the actual app. It seems that the online version doesn't work quite as well as the app does. Oops, that's review. I didn't want that. Animals, get rid of safety. Animals and sky glow. So we have 9 articles here. You would have to look through and see whether they really clearly demonstrate that. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So this one is one by James Foster, looking at dung beetles in South Africa. And so there he's showing that the sky glow itself is changing the beetle behavior. And I think that there's a paper, well, anyway, you'll have to take a look through the database. I'm afraid I can't quite just answer it straight off the top.
Okay,
So,
thank you very much.
Yeah, so Yasha's got a question, and we can see if Raskin's got something from the chat.
Yeah, great presentation, thanks. I had a question about the VRS satellite data, and you talked about measuring some of these at different, like cloudy versus overcast nights. So I was curious. I mean, I had a project where I'm going to try and do this across locations. How long do you think one has to monitor like a site to get a baseline reading when it comes to, like, what's the minimum amount of time you need to get something like or this is what the average is at that site on a clear night or a cloudy night?
From the VIRS, you mean specifically?
Yeah. No, I mean from like using the SQM or using any of the monitoring devices that one has.
Yeah, it really depends on where you are. So if you're looking at sky brightness, especially in a city, you can get a good idea pretty quick, but of course overcast and clear nights are very different. So I would say, though, if you have, say, several months of data, you should have a pretty good idea about what sky glows like on clear nights and cloudy nights. With changes in light, it's really troublesome with an instrument like the SQM, because it depends on how the spectrum changes. So there's a review paper by I'll share this. Andreas Haenel is the lead author. Oops, he's not a keyword. So measuring night sky brightness, methods and challenges. That's the name of the paper. And you can definitely find an open access version online, even if from the publisher it's not. If you search for that, you'll find copies that are freely available.
Okay.
Yeah. If I could jump in here, Chris, this is Pete. Ruskin has had some computer issues. And I'd just like to say that you've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay. So we got to be quick then. So Pete, if you could look in the chat whether there's any questions that I should answer, that would be great. In the meantime, Paul, go ahead, please.
What I was going to say was just that some of these things could be solved if there was the will to do it by randomized controlled trials, as in medicine. You know, for example, introducing lighting in a properly randomized way. It costs a lot of money, but probably not as much money as that being wasted and the ecological damage caused by just implementing things willy-nilly.
Yeah, you're almost certainly right, Paul. Lighting costs a lot of money when you look at the scale. And so it'd be great if we could get more research into these areas. Tarun, you have a question?
Yeah,
can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah. So like my question is, in case I don't have an SQM, but still I want to measure the brightness levels in my area, for example. So is there anything, any parameters that I can measure? For example, if I take an image of the sky in lightings and another image without like the lightings off. Okay, and then I can compare few parameters, and based on those parameters, I can make some conclusions that, okay, this was the percentage that was there in lighting and without lighting. So what could be those parameters that can help me understand or identify that, okay, I can measure the light pollution?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. If you're using a camera where you can change the settings manually, then you may be able to do some relative comparisons, like you said. The trouble would be you need to work with the raw data of the camera. You can't work with the JPEG images. You have to work with really the raw images, and you have to be able to manually set the exposure and ISO settings so that you can make sure that they're really comparable between each other. Then you're going to need to use the same area of the camera in both cases, because cameras have a problem where the edges tend to be darker than the center. So unless you go into a lab or find some way to correct for that, you're going to want to use sort of the same part of the camera in both of the comparisons. So yeah, if you do that, the other thing you should do is take an image that's completely dark so that you can subtract that off from both of the images, because sometimes cameras have noise, depends on the system. But if you do all those things, then you could use a camera to get a relative change in the one condition compared to the other. So I hope that helps. One thing that is being worked on in the research community is developing a pipeline for automatically calibrating at least DSLR cameras based on Zoltan is there. So if you see Zoltan's, if you can find his name in the chat and look him up, then potentially he'll give you some feedback on what you could do. So thanks a lot, Zoltan, for popping up the comment there.
Yeah.
So the point is, I think that in several years, this is going to start to become much easier than it is currently, I hope.
Yeah, this is Pete chiming in. We got about 4 minutes left. A question from the chat is, and this is from Ruskin, is, as advocates, how can we deal with the uncertainties of the unknowns? How do we avoid it becoming an excuse not to act?
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Ruskin. So there's this thing called the precautionary principle, which suggests that you ought to take action even in the face of uncertainty when you're concerned that there could be negative sides. What I think is generally the most effective thing is we're generally arguing for effective lighting, for sustainable lighting. We're not arguing, in at least many cases, for actual darkness. So when you can show people different examples that show, look, here is more light and it's worse, right? But if we do this effectively, then it's great. I like to also talk about leveling the playing field. So if you want to, if you have multinational corporations like Subway or Coca-Cola that are going to advertise all night long, and next to them is a mom and pop sandwich store or a local cola, right? That is wants to be more responsible and turn their signs off. This is not really a level playing field. So if we were to have a rule that in our community, every the rules on illuminated signs are the same for everybody, that's more fair. So I think that coming at these sorts of angles are a good idea. Similarly with gas stations, we don't want to have a competition between who tries to have the brightest canopy lighting. That's not safe, because when you leave the bright canopy lighting going onto the street, especially for older drivers, it's going to be hard to adapt. So we ought to just have a level playing field for everybody and rules about canopy lighting. So it's not about saying you can't light. It's about saying, look, we ought to, public and private lighting ought to work together. And we want to have effective lighting. That's really the goal. So that's my opinion. And in general, effective lighting can be done with much less light.
Okay, we have one more question here I think we can take, and that is, hi, is there research on the spectrum of sky glow from a city? Thanks.
Yeah, there is some. I have a paper actually from several years ago. It's called Red is the New Black. And that was looking at how the spectrum of sky glow changes on cloudy nights compared to clear nights. I'm not sure if that was quite what your question was, but we do know some things, for example, that the spectrum of sky glow changes as you go further away from the city, tends to become more red. And we also know, at least in a few cities, that the spectrum is changing over the course of the night. So at least in Berlin, the city becomes more blue as the night goes on. And this is probably giving us a hint as to which types of lights are turning off, but that's an area of very active research.
And I guess there's time for one more question. It says, is the research in light pollution in general well funded and a growing research area, or is it just a small academic specialty and struggling all the time?
Well, I think all academics are in a struggle all the time. Light pollution 15 years ago was really tiny and really niche. If you look at questions like sky glow, it was generally done by either people who were working full-time in astronomy and devoted a small amount or their extra time onto sky glow research, or people who were retired. Starting in about 2010, 2012, we started to see, particularly on the biology side, a lot more larger scale research things going on. And so it has been growing very rapidly over a little bit more than the last decade. Sort of a turning point was when Catherine Rich and Travis Longcore published their book and their article. I think that really stimulated a lot of new research into impacts of light pollution. So it's definitely a growing field, but like all academics, it's very difficult to get funding. Very many of the grants that I write get rejected. Addressing some of these questions that we've said are still these known unknowns. So it's hard, but we try our best.
Okay, and with that, we're going to thank Chris for joining us and giving us this excellent talk and information on this huge resource and database that's out there for everyone to use. So with that, I thank you. And with this session, we'll be coming to an end. Our next will be starting at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 10 o'clock Mountain Time, and do the time corrections for whatever yours are. And we'll be hitting into the North, Central, and South American regions. So with that, Thank you very much, and we'll see you shortly.